what often happens is when an employee starts, you more times than not, everything is not ready.
Onboarding, it's the first real signal that you're sending to the person you're bringing in about who you are as an organization.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another episode of our AMA. My name is Mike Almeida. I'm joined by my co-host Mark Gibson, and we're going to talk about a topic that I believe everybody's experienced at least one time in their professional life. And that is when you bring somebody new to your company, whether you're starting as an employee or maybe you're a small business owner and you're starting a new employee on day one. There's a lot that goes into that. And getting a new employee started usually takes a lot of time. It takes planning, preparation, takes weeks. And what often happens is when an employee starts, you more times than not, everything is not ready. And so what happens is that creates productivity challenges, missed opportunities for them to really hit the ground running. And they're not as productive as they can be if everything was done ahead of time. So the question that we're aiming to answer today, I'm going to lead off and hand this over to you, Mark, is how do I ensure that my employee is ready to work on day one?
So obviously, we're talking about this through the lens a little bit more from an IT perspective, but onboarding is broader than that, right? So it's about how can we make sure the assets and the IT pieces or whatever are all plugged into a seamless, business function of onboarding. And so this is actually an area I spend a lot of time with. I'm very passionate about this particular topic, I guess we'll say, in terms of, because I think to me, onboarding, it's the first real signal that you're sending to the person you're bringing in about who you are as an organization, right? A lot of times in small business, we forget that we're being interviewed too, like during the process, right? So it's not just us interviewing the potential employee, it's them sort of interviewing us as well. And right up until the point where they come in on day one, generally everything has just been sort of talk. At that point, everybody's kind of making promises and this is who I am as an employee, this is who we are as a company, and so on and so forth. And kind of depending on how formal your offer process is, you've really not had any execution up until this point. So day one, when I show up to begin work at your organization, day one is the first time I'm going to give you insight into how we operate. And I think it's, unfortunately, what ends up happening with that day one is that level of emphasis isn't really attached to onboarding for a lot of small businesses. And it happens that, a new employee, sort of shows up and it's almost like they are either an afterthought or an intrusion, right, into what's happening that day. So sometimes it can even feel like, oh, you didn't know I was coming today, that kind of thing. Or, even if you're, hey, glad you're here. Like, they show up at 9 o'clock and by 9:15, it becomes sort of this thing of like, all right, cool. We're going to fit you in around all the other things we got going on today. That, you coming today wasn't necessarily our top priority. We didn't do the preparation we needed to for you to be here. We don't have all the things that you need to complete your onboarding process. And again, onboarding process is, I'm using that term loosely here. We're talking about day one onboarding, depending on how you define it, can stretch out for 30, 60, 90 days, whatever. But, and so I think the way I really think about this from a perspective of the message you send, like the typical way I've seen onboarding through the years is that you send businesses send two messages. One is for the individual that says, hey, sorry, you're not a focus today, but we're busy. And the other message they send that's a little bit more lasting is the idea that, hey, it's okay for us not to execute well when we're busy. And I think both of those are not the right message you want to send, right? I think with an onboarding process that's, sort of tightened up a little bit better, the message can simply be, hey, we've made you a focus despite the fact that we're busy. Paired with another message that says, hey, we still execute when we're busy, right? So it's a matter of, that's a bit more culture than it is IT specific, but this is all playing into that kind of stuff.
So, one thing that stands out to me what you're saying here, Mark, is you're almost saying like you've got to be intentional with onboarding on day one, right? It can't just be an afterthought. So, for an organization to be intentional, what does that look like? Like, what needs to happen? What does that employee need for you to show that you've been intentional about their day one process?
All right. So every business has different details, right? But they all kind of largely fall into three categories, right? Anybody, whether they're new or existing employee, you've got to have the right tools, you got to have the right access, and then you've also got to have the right knowledge or skills. That last one, knowledge or skills, is what the onboarding process is about, right? And it's just this ongoing effort. As long as that person is contributing to the organization, you're always going to be doing training and that kind of stuff. But when we talk about tools and access, that's stuff that really should be available day one. When I walk in the door, there should not be an obstacle to me being able to do the things that you are going to ask me to do right out of the gate. And that's not the typical experience. Typical experience is that can take anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks, right? That you keep uncovering, oh, I don't have access to this. Maybe it's, my email's not working. That's usually something that gets resolved pretty quickly. But I don't have access to a file. I don't have a license for an application. I don't have the login for an application, those kinds of things. So again, I'll narrow it to just the IT perspective. Those three things in particular, or those two things rather, you should be able to nail that down for day one without a whole lot of obstacles.
Got it. Now, what would you attributed like one of the biggest problems on why these things go bad? Like why does onboarding rarely go well on day one?
I think that when you talk about onboarding, messy onboarding is usually a reflection of messy operations. Like it's not that onboarding is an isolated case, right? And so when you start thinking about it upstream, it's usually, again, the deadline snuck up on somebody. It's who's responsible for this. And in fact, it's probably 4 or 5 people are responsible for different pieces of it. And there's no quarterback, of the process. So everybody's kind of looking at each other, with the process. And then the employee starting becomes the focal point of it that brings everything together to go, oh, well, this guy can't work. Why? Well, because of X, Y, Z, right? So it's just a matter of the obstacle is generally reflective of challenges, like I said, sort of upstream, which is the idea that we're not quite clear what the person's doing. We're not quite clear what they need to be successful. We're not quite clear what access they need. We're not clear who is going to be taking them through the training process, all those kinds of things. And then it all comes together as one not so good experience.
I mean, it's almost, Mark, what you're saying, these things sound predictable. Like you could always predict what's not going to go well there. And so I imagine there's probably a solution that you have in mind to help make this predictable outcome or series of outcomes not be so burdensome and not make an employee feel like they're a burden on day one.
Well, yes. I mean, again, this is something I've been, passionate about for a number of years. I think what we lose sight of a lot of times, particularly when we're, on the employer side, is the day-to-day experience of what it's like to be new, right? Almost nobody likes being new. And particularly when it's about being new at a job, you are getting killed with information, right? You are drinking from a fire hose on day one, and probably day 2 and 3 as much as well. But we, in small business in particular, we don't tend to regulate that flow of information. We're like, oh, you're here. And then on top of that, we start assigning tasks. We're like, look, extra capacity. It's unassigned. We can dump this for them. And so it makes a really hard, stressful first few days, for them. So I think if we can start to think about our onboarding process from the lens of the employee, to know what they're kind of going through as they're trying to get their sea legs. That's one part of it. The other part of it, though, is to keep in mind for yourself, this is an iterative process. You are not going to get this right, right out of the gate. And it's kind of going to build over time. But, if you do a good job of sort of evaluating that process after it's happened and understanding where your gaps are, then you usually should be able to have enough information to do it better the next time. The solution to that, though, is who owns this outcome? Who owns this process? Who's responsible for the onboarding activity at your organization? Again, we're talking about IT primarily, but IT is coordinating with somebody on the business side to identify all of these right tools and assets that are needed. So that's, I think, the two biggest pieces of the solution is really to make sure that there's an owner, but then that also it's blended with some empathy for the experience as the user will have it as they come in as an employee.
You're saying that reminded me of a story not too long ago. When I was working for a different company, I had onboarded a brand new employee, but I remember that before I did that, I had worked on a series of requirements, defined a role, and identified the needs were before. And so I remember the feedback from that employee on the first day was, wow, I feel like I can actually be productive. Those are his words, not mine, because I've got all this stuff ready to go. And I had a peer of mine who shortly after that brought a new person on, didn't really have a plan. And the strategy was, I'm going to take everything in my mind that is weighing me down and give it to this new employee. And within 4 or 5 months, I recall that person saying, this person's just not doing what I need them to do. And I don't understand why. And what triggered that thought in my mind is what you just walked through about if you have this series and understand what success looks like, the outcomes are different. And clearly, as I remind myself of that story, same company, 2 separate strategies, 2 separate outcomes. So what would you say are the benefits when you start to put this structure in place, like you're saying, or really have some success criteria? What are some of the benefits that small business owners in particular can see when they intentionally do that?
Well, I think let's just start with the story you were telling there, the contrast there, which in terms of the employee relationship starts off way, way better, right? In terms of clear expectations about what's happening there, but also recognizing that, when you talk about the idea of setting them up for success, it treats it a little bit more as a partnership, not necessarily as an employee-employer. Not that that's not a clear distinction to make, but it's more about the idea that, hey, I have a role in this, you have a role in this. There's some shared success that needs to happen here. It's not about the idea of me just dumping things on you and you figure it out as you go along. Because if that is again indicative of sort of the culture that you're working in, and that sends a pretty poor sign. So I'd say it sets the tone, right? The other part of it is that if you've got a structured onboarding process in a way that people can be productive more quickly, obviously that translates to bottom line dollars, right? As an owner, I mean, there's a direct path, between how productive an individual is and the profitability of your company. And so the idea of having somebody come in and it's not like you're ramping up their salary while you ramp up their activity, right? And I'm not suggesting you should do that, by the way. You should absorb the cost of training, but doing that more efficiently is only going to help you from the P&L perspective as well.
Okay. And practically speaking, obviously you've highlighted some pretty significant benefits, I believe, but small business owner that maybe in the next 30 days, they're going to onboard or hire a new employee. What are some actionable steps this owner can take now to set themselves up or really set the employee up for success on day one?
Yeah. I think the number one thing is, it's probably what I would tell you for, just about every function or process, which is, who owns this? establish the person who's responsible for the outcome. Again, they're not necessarily doing everything, but they're the person who's responsible for the outcome of the onboarding process. But then also in partnership with them, defining what does success look like for this? What does good look like? Like at the end of that, we talked about the idea of being able to iterate. How many times do you think small businesses go back and after 30 days and go, hey, new employee, how do you think we did? What could we have done better? What does it look like from your perspective? What would you have liked to have seen? Every time you ask a question that way, you will get feedback that is from their perspective that you never considered. Now, from there, you can make a decision to not do it, to say, hey, it doesn't fit into our process or whatnot. But somebody's got to have some time for that. They got to have some brain cycles to be able to digest that stuff. And for most small businesses, this onboarding piece isn't owned by anybody. The closest thing is like, oh, we have a trainer, the person who's going to show them how they work, day to day. But even that moves depending on what role you're in. So the onboarding process, even going back to your story again, isn't consistent within the same organization from one department to another, or from one new employee to another. So again, that's the first thing is having somebody to assign it and set some expectations. And then I think, again, making this a little bit more specific to the IT piece of it, that person should set up, we go back to the tools and access piece and say, hey, that should be available on day one. When you're talking about roles, there should be a quick inventory of that says, here are the things they need. They need a laptop. They need a desktop and a monitor. They need a work from home setup. They need a new mobile phone. They might need, a tablet, whatever the devices are, or the tools. But they also need, an email box. They need access to our storage. They need, somebody to walk them through how to, set up MFA and all those kinds of things on that day. And so if they've got the tools and the access, then it really just becomes about business at that point. It's no longer about the technology piece of it.
Awesome. That was really, really powerful steps, I think, to do this. So we've got a lot of questions we're going to run you through here, which is be good. So hopefully you're ready. Here's question number one. What's the single biggest obstacle that keeps new hires from becoming productive on day one? And how can leaders address it right?
So generally speaking, let's go back to tools and access, right? I mean, that's really, as I think about any time I've been an employee in the past or things I've observed, that's usually what keeps you. I mean, because when you come on day one, you have no idea how to do anything, right? Well, I won't say anything, but you don't necessarily know how it's done at the new job, and so then but you can learn all those things. You can mimic those things with people as long as you can get to where you need to go. You think about it more from the physical side of this, right? Like, hey, I need to get to that room, but oh, look, my key card doesn't work to get in there. Of course, you can't do anything, right? Same thing holds for, a laptop or an application. So in terms of maybe the addressing it part, I think this is what ties back directly to what I was saying about having somebody who's responsible for the outcome of that. If nobody knows that a new employee spent 48 hours unproductive before they could, even log into a computer, and it wasn't expected, how are you fixing that internally? Like the new employee's not raising their hand. That's just not a fair expectation, right? Because they don't know what the expectation is for the business. But we're telling them that it's okay, those 48, 72, going back to what I was saying about the messaging piece. So have an owner and make sure access and tools are taken care of. That'll take care of most every problem you have on day one.
Okay. So earlier you talked about roles and technology requirements. The question is, how do poorly defined roles and unclear technology requirements show up during onboarding, and what practical steps can the company take to tighten them before the new hire arrives?
Okay, so there's a lot of words in that one. I think the gist of the question is, how do we make sure we know everything they need?
So it's two parts here. I think the first part is, how do poorly defined roles and unclear technology requirements show up during onboarding? How does it manifest? And then how can you prevent that before the new hire shows up?
Yeah, assuming well, depending on how I'll say segmented or how structured your access is for your environment, it'll show up immediately when the role that needs certain access doesn't have it. Whether that's because somebody hasn't done it yet or it's just not been identified, which is, usually what happens is that, oh, we didn't know they needed this. Um, and then, which is kind of what happens with the technology piece too. Like those things all tie together. Like within the role, like, hey, I'm analyst one. Cool. Analyst one gets these two devices, these three logins, and one other thing. But that's not clearly defined. So when somebody comes in to start, well, they're going to be an analyst. Okay, well, what do they need? And again, we're just kind of building it from scratch every single time, and it becomes manual, and there's room for error, and it takes longer than it should, all that kind of stuff. So that's maybe the answer to the first question, or the first part. What was the second part?
The second one was, what practical steps can a company take to tighten them before the new hire arrives? So,
yeah. Well, I think we talked about most of that already. The one thing maybe I would add is, particularly as it comes to, say, like inventory, like whether it's like licenses or maybe devices and so forth, is carry a spare, so that maybe if a device has a 2-week lead time on it, that obviously requires some prep that may not be happening. But if you have a spare laptop or whatever, you can absorb that timeline without it being an impact to the individual. And same thing with licenses. It depends on how quickly you make those orders, I guess we'll say. But from a tangible impact of tools, that's what I would recommend as the easiest way to clean that up.
Yeah, I'm going to skip down because I think there's you said something, and one of the questions that I see came in here, I think aligns with it. What inventory practices, like spare devices or laptops, have you found most effective for reducing delays when bringing someone on board?
Yeah, that what I was just saying essentially is, again, you don't want to have too much of a cushion, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you don't want to have unused inventory, but if you're an organization of, it's not just for onboarding. You should also have this in case for just general efficiency purposes. But if you're in an environment of 20, 25 people, you carry a fleet of 25 devices, I'd recommend having a couple extra because, hey, one might fail, one might have an onboarding or whatnot, and then just kind of backfill that as you add roles or positions if you can, afford to do that. Obviously, that's a little bit more expense than like the software component of it usually is. When you're thinking something like a Microsoft or Google, that stuff's usually, you can kind of add it almost real time. But if it's maybe a specialized app or whatnot, sometimes you got to place an order, and procurement takes a little bit of time and that kind of stuff. So just, right size it based on how your organization works, but, just to try to sort of mitigate any risks you have of somebody just sitting there twiddling their thumbs.
Do you have an opinion on the best day of the week a new employee should start working?
So me personally, I hate Monday onboardings. I understand why they are popular, and I understand why they're so common. Listen, if you've got this process locked down, it really doesn't matter. But generally, it's not locked down, and because of that, it leads to what we were talking about early on. Like Mondays are just harder in businesses typically. Again, I'm kind of speaking from a 9 to 5 Monday through Friday office. So whatever your rhythm is, right? But the beginning of the week, not necessarily Monday specifically, but the beginning of the week is always harder when you come in. And so I don't know why people just say, hey, let's start somebody on that day when the existing staff, particularly in small business, is going to have a crap ton of other stuff to do. So I don't know. I think it might be, again, sort of look at your rhythms. Maybe you start people on like a Thursday and have them come in, do a couple of days, and then have the weekend to digest stuff. To me, that's what I'm maybe a little more interested in for us, like as we do those things, is to try to ease in a little bit. But you got to manage all that stuff.
I think, well said. I know for you and I, we have a lot of our meetings on Monday, right? Intentionally. So I couldn't imagine us onboarding someone on Monday because that would disturb our rhythm quite significantly, right? So good answer. All right. Oh, here's a good one. Okay. what are the most common clunky IT handoff moments you've seen, and how can a partnership between HR and IT streamline things like device provisioning and software setup?
Hmm. Um, so the complexity of and this isn't really tied to onboarding. The complexity of how identity is managed, think usernames, accounts, passwords, so forth, will lend itself to complicating this process. So, if we've got 10 apps and that's 10 accounts and that's 10 licenses and 10, so what I'm talking about is, maybe having some type of single sign-on or centralized platform that you're working from, a domain, those kinds of things. That's probably the most, that's probably the clunkiest part of it, I guess I'll say. But what compounds that is not having a standard for the lead time that you hand off to your IT team. So the idea of, hey, again, somebody starting on Monday, by the way, we let you know that Thursday at 4:30, that's not really, that's not conducive to having those things configured and done well. So I think that's those are probably the two things that are the most shot. The other one thing goes back to the inventory we're talking about is, hey, by the way, if somebody's starting in 2 days, there's no device. This goes back to kind of how you procure laptops and so forth. If you go and buy things from Best Buy, sure, you can maybe make that work, but there's a whole host of other reasons why you shouldn't do that. And so, just making sure you have enough lead time for those things. That's what makes this stuff sort of push beyond day one for users.
Good answer. All right. Earlier, you talked about a messy onboarding process was a signal of messy operations. And so your question says, in what ways does the onboarding process act as a stress test for existing business processes? And how can companies turn those stress or messy signals into concrete improvement opportunities?
Okay. So operating in that way first, or excuse me, how does it operate maybe as a stress test? It's somebody coming in with fresh eyes, right? They have no idea what the little tips and tricks are, for sort of navigating the environment, I guess I'll say. So, when you think about a stress test, in this context, it's somebody who doesn't know how to cover the gaps. Like your existing employees know how to do that because they've stubbed their toe a few times already. New employees come in and they have no idea, right? So they're going to reveal all of those little misalignments and gaps that you have in your process. In terms of how you iterate that or do something to improve it, that's going to tie right back to the owner part, right? There's got to be a process that gathers that feedback. There's got to be somebody who owns taking that and turning it into something a little bit smoother the next time around. And that person, is going to be on the business side, or should be, because they're going to have to navigate from they're going to have to marry the operations from 2 or 3 different places. IT just being one of them.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. All right. And I think we might have time for one or maybe 2 questions here. Here's a good one. How can managers or owners balance the need for rapid onboarding with the reality that new hires are essentially drinking from a fire hose of information?
The same way we talk about being able to maximize, I'm sorry, I don't know what the word was there that was being used there. But when I think about it, what I heard was efficiency maybe, or profitability, something along those lines.
Yeah. With the reality that they're drinking from a fire hose of information.
It's that it's priority management. Like at the end of the day, understanding the capabilities and capacity that this new person brings to the table, they are generally not going to be able to hit the ground running from an operational perspective. How quickly they can do that is going to be absolutely dependent upon whether or not you have a structured operation for them to absorb. And if you don't, they won't. And so it's going to take 3 weeks for them to know how to file an expense report or whatever, all those things that are largely sort of one-on-one. And again, you, the business owner, know how to do it. 3, 4, 5 other employees who've been here forever know how to do it. But there's a group of people who maybe never learned. They just started. The process changed, whatever the case may be. So what I'm saying is all of that makes it harder, which usually means it takes longer, which is about the question of what can I put in the fire hose for this guy to drink while he's here? And it's only the stuff that's accessible in the moment. So day one has got to be only what he's prepared to do. Day two is a little bit more. Day three, it's got to be incremental as you go along to it.
All right. So last question here for you, Mark. If you could implement just one actionable change tomorrow to improve your onboarding flow, what would it be and why?
Oh, that's an easy one. Assign an owner. Done. Like all the iterations will come from that. Once you have the same person looking at this nonstop, they will see all the cracks and they'll be like, oh, okay, cool. This is how we close it. All the other things are conceptual. They are probably common across, different processes, but for an individual business, they need one person to look at the repetitions of this within the specifics of your environment. That's the first thing I would do.
Excellent. Well, Mark, it's always fun to jump on here and spitball these questions at you, man. So I appreciate it. And I appreciate all of our watchers and listeners. So again, if you follow us on LinkedIn, you'll get updates about Strategy Bites episodes. And if you want to follow us on YouTube, just make sure you click and subscribe to our channel and you'll get updates on the latest videos. So Mark, thanks again for your time. Much enjoyed. And I'll catch you in the next episode.
Thanks, guys.
Take care.